Good Wednesday morning to you. I'm continuing the series of Can You Relate? And as you may have heard yesterday, I'm in Corpus Christi at our convocation. Today, our special guest is Pastor Scott Ness. He is one of my dear friends. He's my prayer partner, and we share a lot of good stories and good life of faith together.
Absolutely.
Today, we are talking about the next character in the series, and that is Reuben. Scott was really excited to get Reuben. And
how many of you woke up this morning thinking about Reuben from the Old Testament?
Not a Reuben, because I hear Arby's makes a really good Reuben.
They do. It's good.
But Reuben, who is the eldest son of Leah and Jacob, he is the oldest of 12 brothers. So for those of you that come from big families, you can imagine what it's like to be the oldest child and then the oldest of all of those siblings.
Youngest children are cooler.
We can talk about that later,
Okay.
maybe. So today's story about Reuben, it starts in Genesis 37, continues on into the narrative. This is really picks up with Joseph and his brothers. So yesterday, Patty and I talked a little bit about Joseph and who he is in the story. We know probably the most famous story of Joseph is when his brothers sell him to slavery. If you've never looked at the details of the story, it's kind of fascinating because in Genesis 37, when the brothers have kind of lured him out to the fields, and they really plan on killing him in the story, Reuben actually comes to Joseph's defense. And Reuben says, why don't you throw him in a well instead of killing him, instead of doing harm to him? And it's kind of an interesting twist. Now, if you go back to a little bit back to when we first are introduced to Reuben, it's kind of an odd story. Leah has just died, and if you remember, Leah has a maidservant, Bilhah, who has been given to Jacob as a wife. Jacob moves his bed into Bilhah's tent quite quickly after Leah dies, and that Reuben takes great offense to that. And so the Jewish understanding is that Reuben moves Jacob's tent or a bed back out of the tent. Often the way that those verses are translated out of the Hebrew, there's kind of suspicion of maybe Reuben actually sleeps with Bilhah, takes advantage of her. And either way, this instance rejects Jacob and Reuben have a problem with each other. Jacob rejects Reuben as his son and actually takes away his birthright. The interesting detail about that when we're first introduced to Reuben is that birthright is given to Joseph, who is the youngest son. Now, there's a lot of fun with family systems, and I'm the oldest child in my family. Scott's the youngest child in his family, and you can see how this played out off camera. But that's really what happened. So Reuben's birthright, which is a big deal in the Old Testament narrative, is given to Joseph because Reuben acts out of his grief with his father. And now we're in a situation where Reuben actually becomes protective. Maybe that older child protection that is inherent in that role, he takes over and he protects Joseph from being killed, and instead Joseph is sold into slavery. So Scott, here's the question. How do we relate to this?
I don't
Is
know.
there something in there?
I've got nothing. No, I'm just kidding.
Something tells me you have something.
No, the story of Reuben is fascinating, and the story of Joseph and the brothers and the oldest and the youngest. But that beautiful story, as Pastor Jody mentioned, of Reuben kind of stepping in as the rest of the brothers, kind of a mob mentality, say, let's kill him because we're sick of him streaming. We're sick of Dad choosing him, favoring him. Parents always favor the younger ones. But there's just and Reuben steps in and says, well, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in a pit. And I don't know about you, but certainly there are times when I know implicitly, explicitly something that I shouldn't do. And then there are times when I don't do that, but I do something like not quite as bad. Well, I wasn't that bad, so I feel good about myself. And I feel like that's a little bit of maybe what Reuben was going through as we kind of relate and think of this story as well. He didn't kill his brother. He just threw him in a pit and convinced his brother to do it. I don't know. I think there's something there. I think there's also some, the line in that story is that Reuben kind of snuck back after the brothers came up with this plan to sell him into slavery, to traffic him, as Patty mentioned yesterday, that he was coming actually back to rescue him. So there was kind of a rescue plot implied there. But I don't know, I think Reuben's, the complexity of his situation, the complexity of that role that of trying to be the spokesperson, kind of default for that as the story continues, as Joseph continues to elevate and becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. And kind of Reuben has to eat some crow as he comes back to his brother later on. I think there's just this reality of sometimes I think we make faith too black and white and too easy. And there's something beautiful about Reuben's story that's messy, and my story's messy, and your story's messy.
My story's a little messy.
Your story's a little messy. I wasn't going to say that, but yeah. But there's faith isn't cut and dry. It isn't black and white. It's messy. There's a lot of gray area. I think that's why I love the Lutheran faith, is because we're so good in that gray area, the paradoxical nature. The final thing that I reflect on from this story is that the place where Reuben and the brothers hatched the plan to sell Joseph into slavery was in Dothan, which only triggers my mind because it goes to one of my favorite Old Testament stories, which is the story of Elisha, as he's surrounded by the enemy army, and his servant comes out and he sees the army surrounding him, and he says, "Oh no, my Lord, what are we going to do?" And Elisha says, "Well, first we're going to pray." And as Elisha prays with his servant, he says, "Lord, help my servant to see the way I see." And then he opens his eyes, and there's that army of enemies, and behind him is there an angel army that has profounded him. And the word that Elisha says is, "Greater is he who is in you than who is against you." And as I think of Reuben and his story, and I think of my own story, and as you think of your story, and the messiness of it, that place of Dothan that reminds us that the one who is in us is greater than us, greater than our mess-ups, greater than our mistakes, greater than my failings, greater than your failings. And I think there's something beautiful in that, that greater is he who's in you than who's against you. And even when you're against yourself, even when you deal with all the pressures and all the stuff of life, the one who's working in you is bigger, greater, stronger, mightier, and more beautiful than anything we could ever do in our mess-ups and mistakes. So
that's a pretty good point, especially with Reuben, because he did make mistakes, and he screwed up with his dad, and there's a lot of things he couldn't take back. He couldn't get back. He couldn't get his birthright back. Greater was God in him. And hopefully that's how he acted out when he protected Joseph, was greater than God in him. But it's a great reminder for all of us, in the good and the bad and the ugly. Greater is he who is within us. Yeah,
which is Joseph's final point in the great word from Genesis 50 is what you intended for harm, God intended for good. Yeah. I think there's something beautiful there.
That's pretty cool. So as you reflect on Reuben, as you think about how you can relate, hopefully this has been helpful, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks.